Jules Verne is one of the most recognizable authors of all time, known for his extensive detailing of the scientific concepts that he included in his novels. One of his most popular works was 1865's De la Terre à la Lune, or From the Earth to the Moon. The story focused on the Baltimore Gun Club, a group of American weapons manufacturers attempting to create a gun powerful enough to launch a space capsule to the moon. The novel was not only successful, but it was also massively influential. In 1902, French filmmaker Georges Méliès created one of the first science fiction films, A Trip to the Moon, inspired by Verne's novel. Decades later, in 1969, when the astronauts of Apollo 11 returned from their own trip to the moon, Neil Armstrong drew comparisons between Verne's story and his team's mission. So when it came time to build Discoveryland at Euro Disneyland, an area drawing inspiration from the work of Verne, it was quite obvious how to fit a Space Mountain into it. The issue was the budget. The original concept for Discoveryland Space Mountain was much more than just an enclosed roller coaster. The Imagineers drew up a ginormous pavilion, over twice the size of Space Mountain at Walt Disney World, named Discovery Mountain. Guests would enter the pavilion into an interior themed after a mysterious island, the home port of Captain Nemo and the Nautilus. They would immediately be greeted by the famous submarine peeking out of the water. This ginormous model would house a walk-through attraction, allowing guests to experience the interior of the Nautilus, similar to the original Disneyland exhibit. Near this area would have also been an underwater restaurant themed to the interior of the sub, so that guests could dine aboard the Nautilus and stare out at the ocean life. This was another attempt to utilize a concept from the never-built Discovery Bay. The pavilion would also allow guests to have direct access to Star Tours and Captain EO. At one point, it was rumored that the popular Epcot dark ride Horizons would be cloned and placed within the pavilion, and concept art showed the Jules Verne show scene from the ride replicated and placed above guests. There was also a steampunk-themed train station that the Euro Disneyland Railroad could stop at, a drop tower based on another Jules Verne property, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and finally, a Space Mountain themed after From the Earth to the Moon. This Space Mountain would not only take guests from the Earth to the stars, but it also allowed them to navigate the lunar surface. Guests would be shot out of a large cannon, akin to Verne's space gun, and be sent to the moon. They would then wind through craters and rock formations before returning back to Earth. Non-riders within the pavilion could even watch the coaster speed through the stars from areas referred to as telescope points. Discovery Mountain and its attractions would be another ambitious Imagineering concept that would never come to fruition. And it is quite obvious why. While the idea itself seems great, the show building, pavilion, and all of the attractions would have come with an enormous price tag, well outside of Euro Disney's original construction budget. This was one of the reasons that Disney decided to wait a few years after Euro Disney's opening to greenlight the project. Their thinking was that if the resort turned a profit quickly, they would have the funds necessary to build Discovery Mountain. On top of this, they could partner the opening of the new attractions with a marketing push designed not only to bring new guests into the resort, but encourage past visitors to return. Of course, this was the plan pre-opening, and after Euro Disney debuted, everything changed. Attendance was less than half of what was expected, and the hotels were so empty that one was temporarily closed to save money. In 1993 alone, the company reported a loss of around $1 billion. Efforts were made to renegotiate contracts and payments between Disney, the Euro Disney subsidiary, and the creditor banks, in an attempt to avoid the resort from declaring bankruptcy. However, these initial attempts failed, and on January 1st, 1994, Eisner began warning the public that Euro Disney Resort might close. He even began considering withdrawing from the resort entirely, abandoning the subsidiary Euro Disney SCA to deal with the banks and debt on its own. When asked why he was making such threats to the company that Disney was so heavily invested in, Eisner replied, "The word threaten doesn't seem fair to me." He went on to say that Disney would fully support Euro Disney SCA. Until March 31st, or in other words, less than 3 months. Eisner explained that if a fair accord is found from now until then between the Walt Disney Company and all the banks and investors, then Euro Disney continues. That would be a happy end in the tradition of the Disney universe. While March 31st was how long Disney's support was promised, the involved parties really only had until March 15th to sort out $3.5 billion in debt, because that was the day of the annual shareholders meeting. Euro Disney SCA would need to be able to report some sort of update on the restructuring plan, and assurance of Disney support to avoid the bankruptcy. Somehow, on March 14th, the day before the shareholders meeting, a restructuring was announced, in which Disney, the creditor banks, and a wealthy Saudi prince invested in the resort. The banks also forgave interest payments in an attempt to decrease the large debt. While the deal allowed the resort to avoid bankruptcy, all of the measures of the restructuring were temporary. The banks deferred interest for 3 years, and Disney would not demand royalty payments from the resort for 5, practices that could not be continued for long. It was clear that the restructuring was not a solution for Disney. They were stalling. While the executives and investors were dealing with the financial issues, the Imagineers were hard at work. Due to the lack of funds, Tim Delaney and his team knew that they would not be able to create the Discovery Mountain Pavilion in its entirety, but this did not stop them from implementing a few of the ideas. The first step to the expansion was to build a lagoon in Discoveryland where a large model of the Nautilus would be placed. Guests could enter the submarine for a walk through an exhibit called The Mysteries of the Nautilus. While it appears that guests are under the lagoon, the entrance to the attraction actually takes them to a completely separate show building, and the Nautilus seen outside is merely a model. The Mysteries of the Nautilus debuted on July 4th, 1994. By then, a ginormous structure with a familiar shape already loomed behind it. While the Imagineers did not have the budget for it in its original form, they had found the funds to build a Discovery Mountain. Instead of a pavilion filled with attractions, this conical structure would feature just one, the enclosed coaster themed after Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon.
Your destination, outer space. Your speed, astronomical. Your closest encounter, asteroids. Between the Earth and the Moon lies the adventure. Space Mountain, the greatest ride in the universe, at Disneyland Paris.
The new ride was named Discovery Mountain throughout production and construction. However, around a month before the ride opened, management was convinced that Space Mountain would be more effective in marketing, so the name was changed to Space Mountain From the Earth to the Moon. Since the attraction was so far into development when this decision was made, numerous signs had already been created with the initials DM, and they remained in the attraction despite the name change. After pouring all of the money Euro Disney could find into construction and marketing, Space Mountain From the Earth to the Moon opened on June 1st, 1995.
Told us that this ride goes really, really fast.
Yeah, it really looks great.
Oh, yeah. Sounds fun.
See you later, Donald.
Bye, Donald.
Okay, here we go. We're not going very fast, are we? I thought.
As guests approached the new Space Mountain, it was immediately clear that this was much different than any one that had come before it. For one, the exterior copper finish was highly stylistic, blending in perfectly with the rest of Discoveryland. Also, the massive bronze cannon attached to the side of the mountain provided an incredible exterior show. Every few minutes, the cannon would fire, and out of the barrel would come a bullet containing screaming guests. Perfectly placed smoke effects gave the appearance that the guests had been shot into the sky, going so fast that they had disappeared out of the other side of the cannon. As guests entered the queue, they were surprised to find themselves on a platform in the middle of the ride, with trains and special effects surrounding them, giving a preview of what was to come. Guests eventually wind their way into the home of the Baltimore Gun Club, in which drawings of the planned space gun could be seen. It is also set up here that a member of the club has started a space mining company, and drawings of his machines were also on display. After waiting for the majority of the queue inside, guests exit onto the side of the mountain. The loading station is outside, as guests need to enter the space gun in order to be shot into space. After boarding their vehicles, guests are put directly into the barrel of the cannon. At this point, the ride reveals one of its most impressive features, the newly developed SOBAT, or Synchronized Onboard Audio Track. This allows for music and sound effects to be played directly to guests, with the track being timed perfectly to emphasize different experiences throughout the attraction. From the Earth to the Moon score, written by composer Steve Bramson, is a beautiful, heroic, and epic melody, and is one of the highlights of the ride. But sound is just one of the many elements with which the coaster would impress its riders. The next came after guests had entered the cannon. Sitting on an incline, the guests wait as the gun is prepared. The sides open, and the train is lifted into position. Just as the music builds, guests are launched, traveling upward 40 miles per hour through smoke. Then, a drop down reveals that they have made it to space. A bank left swoops guests through the stars and by asteroids. The turn levels out into a drop, sending guests into another surprise, a full loop, making this the first and so far only Space Mountain to feature any type of inversion. After finishing the loop, the train speeds ahead, weaving its way through a large space mining tool. Guests are then taken up a curved incline and make their way through the smoky interior of a hollowed meteor. The train then performs a long corkscrew before slowing down a bit and coming onto a lift hill. Guests are then given a view of the smiling moon, similar in style to the George Méliès film. After finally reaching their destination, guests plummet back down to Earth, making their way through more meteors and another inversion before a series of lights signal that the train is about to stop. Guests then swoop down and enter the electro-develocitor, a device designed to land the bullets sent to the moon. Guests are given their last burst of smoke before the music transitions to a victorious march. The train then exits the mountain and returns to the loading station. To say that Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon was an impressive ride would not do it justice. The technology, the music, and the theming were amazing, but perhaps the most brilliant part of the ride was its ability to tell a story despite its fast-paced design. The nearly $90 million ride was a huge gamble for Euro Disney. The company was relying on the attraction to reinvigorate interest in the park. In Euro Disney's annual report sent out to shareholders in the years leading up to its release, the company mentioned the ride and the way in which it would turn the resort around. This put a lot of unfair pressure on the ride to draw audiences in, but somehow, it surpassed all expectations. Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon was a smashing success. The ride seemed to even please some of the French public so critical of Euro Disney in its beginning. The ride's heavy marketing and rave reviews caused resort attendance to skyrocket. And a year after Space Mountain's opening, the newly named Disneyland Paris was happy to announce its first quarterly profit, $35 million. A small number, but a huge victory. Talks of the park closing ceased, and Michael Eisner even personally thanked designer Tim Delaney for saving Euro Disney. The coaster had done everything that it had set out to do, and more. However, Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon would only get to entertain guests for 1 decade, because while it had saved the resort, a new round of misfortune would soon be on its way.
Opening of the Walt Disney Studios, take 1.
Lights. Camera.
Moteur, Saturn.
Action.
Thrilled to see Disneyland Paris finally turning a profit, Eisner decided to go ahead with one of the original plans for the resort, a second gate. The decision was made after the turnaround in 1996 to finally build Disney MGM Studios Europe, in part to fulfill a promise made to investors early on in Euro Disney's development. The issue was that Disneyland Paris was doing better, but it wasn't steady just yet. On top of this, Disney MGM Studios in Orlando was having a difficult time adjusting to the reduced number of productions being shot at the studios. The park was in sort of a theming limbo, caught between the original Universal Studios Hollywood production Tram Tour and the new Universal Studios Florida Ride the Movie style. It would remain in this limbo for nearly 20 years before eventually going all in on the latter. Regardless, this made creating Disney MGM Studios Europe all the more difficult, as its source material was not confident in its own theming. However, Eisner and the executives pushed on, and created the second gate anyways, opening as Walt Disney Studios Park on March 16, 2002. The construction budget for the resort was a mere $550 million. Even California Adventure cost at least $600 million. The result was a park which mainly consisted of shows and demonstrations. On opening day, the theme park only featured 3 rides: Rock and Roller Coaster, the Studio Tram Tour, and Magic Carpets of Aladdin. On top of the park's lack of pull among guests, the terrorist attacks of September 11th hurt the tourism industry worldwide. Disney also cited the war with Iraq, the outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome in Asia, harsh weather in Europe, and a series of transportation strikes. All of these things sent the resort spiraling, and Euro Disney SCA called for help once again. Disney and the investors had to restructure the resort's finances for a second time, and the Disneyland Paris resort needed another attendance boost after the process to get back on track. In order to do so, they would turn to the attraction that was once their savior. To coincide with the 10th year anniversary of the ride, and more importantly, create a desperately needed attendance boost, Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon was retooled to Space Mountain Mission 2.
Mickey was waiting outside for me with the supercomputer. Bingo! Camera detected on outer edges of the galaxy in Space Mountain Mission 2. afterwards, the camera was nowhere to be seen.
The new version of the ride saw the removal of the vast majority of the Jules Verne theming, and the new mission took guests all across the universe. This saw a lot of the story accents replaced by generic space-themed objects. For instance, the smiling moon was changed to an animation of a supernova. Most large structures and scenes remained, and various lighting effects were added throughout the ride. Perhaps too many, as parts of the track and show building were exposed. The cannon launch was altered so that the train started from a point lower down on the incline. The cars were repainted to silver instead of bronze, and most disappointing of all, the original score to the ride was replaced for a new one written by Michael Giacchino, the famous composer that had worked on the updated Space Mountain scores for Disneyland in Anaheim and Hong Kong. The result was a Space Mountain similar in design to its predecessor, but without the story and theming that had made the original experience so unique. Mission 2 was still the most exhilarating Space Mountain on Earth, but now it was no different than any of the others in terms of story. Worse, the change came for the purpose of a lazy marketing scheme, in that Disneyland Paris can now market Space Mountain as a brand new ride, despite it just being a watered-down version of the original. Space Mountain Mission 2 would operate for over a decade, closing in January of 2017 to undergo a renovation. Rumors had circulated for years that Mission 2 would eventually be reverted back to its former glory. But, of course, this wasn't the case. Quite the opposite, really. When Paris' Space Mountain would reopen in May of 2017, it received the Star Wars Hyperspace Mountain treatment. This overlay first appeared in Disneyland and Anaheim in 2015, then again in Hong Kong in 2016. All of the Hyperspace Mountain overlays rely on the use of projection mapping to add recognizable ships and planets from the Star Wars universe. These work a lot better with the classic Space Mountain style, because Paris' version just feels empty and sad. This version of the ride is only supposed to last until mid to late 2018. After this, Space Mountain Mission 2 will return, but many fans are still hoping that From the Earth to the Moon will eventually make its way back to Discoveryland. It was everything you could want out of an attraction: a well-told story, perfect theming, innovative technology, and monetarily successful. It was the best Space Mountain, and it saved Euro Disney, even if it was just for a little while. As for the Disneyland Paris Resort, it has always bragged about being the #1 tourist destination in Europe. While this might be the case, this is in no way an indication of success. It has limped along, showing some glimmers of hope before being devastated by financial issues once again, and the Walt Disney Company has recently taken it over. In early 2018, CEO Bob Iger promised a large investment in the resort. This will hopefully be the end of the struggles of Disneyland Paris, but the damage has already been done. Its initial failures created a domino effect within the Walt Disney Company, affecting all areas of the parks division. During what was one of the most successful times for Disney Studios, Euro Disney held the company behind. The financial issues would force the closure of many fan-favorite rides, and see the cancellation of many ambitious projects. If any good was to come out of the resort's failure, it would be an important lesson. When one goes in with the mindset that failure is impossible, or when one's only worries that they will be too successful, they will be completely caught off guard by even slightly missing the mark. Perhaps the most ironic part is that Jules Verne himself believed that the entrepreneurs of the United States possessed the exact opposite trait. As he wrote in the final line of From the Earth to the Moon, "It is part of the American temperament to foresee everything in business, even failure."